And we're here with Francesca de Châtel, who's going to talk about on the theme of vanishing water landscape, perceptions of water security and conflict in the Middle East and North Africa. And is going to talk to you about this and also to our online audience. And if you wish to tweet about that, about the talk or about issues arising, then please do use the hashtag SIPRI events. And online audience who wish to ask questions, also please use hashtag SIPRI events. So Francesca is a journalist. She trained as an architect and as a journalist, and she's been writing and thinking and reporting about water for 15 years or so in the Middle East, including a considerable period of time living in Damascus from 2006 until 2010, where she was the managing editor and editor-in-chief of Syria Today, which was an independent English language current affairs magazine. I guess we're all aware of the Middle East as a place where water is an issue. And this being SIPRI, this being the Peace Research Institute, where we think about conflict a lot, obviously one of our great interests is in water as a background topic or a background issue when thinking about peace and conflict. How could water issues lead towards political instability and peace and conflict? How could peace and conflict have an impact on the water and the availability, or the scarcity, or whatever of water? So that's the angle that we take. But Francesca takes a broader angle and thinks about water in the Middle East in a fuller, I think, from what I've gathered both from listening to you and from reading a couple of your articles, a fuller, a longer term, to some degree an anthropological and cultural starting point as much as political, social, let alone technical. So we really interested to hear where you take us with the conversation, and we will have about, as we've agreed, 20 to 25 minutes from Francesca by way of a presentation, and then we'll open it out for discussion and questions and so on. So Francesca, over to you. And if you don't mind, so that I don't have to wreck my neck by looking up at the screen,
sure,
I'm going to move
yes,
to another seat,
sure.
but I'll be back to join you when you finish.
So I push this to go forward, right? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Hello. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. Well, as Dan has already introduced me, I won't spend much time telling you more about myself. As Dan mentioned, I've spent quite a long time working on water. I started actually in the year 2000, so nearly 18 years. And so during this time, I have seen a lot change. Unfortunately, I've seen a lot worsen. But there's also been changes in the area that I'm interested in, which is also how people perceive water and how water is discussed and talked about. So all of this I will talk to you about. I'll also be talking about the worsening water crisis in the region and what I think are some of the causes, some of the impacts. And I'm afraid that I will not be able to offer you any solutions, but hopefully we can discuss potential ways forward. So, to start, this slide shows you water availability, global water availability, and also beneath this is Middle East and North Africa. So as you can see, the slide kind of shows several things. It shows on the one hand that, as you can see, the Middle East has always been a water scarce area. but you also see that now it is really very scarce. And so internationally, the limit for scarcity is 1,000 cubic meters per person per year. And so you see that now, on average, the region is well below this. There are, I'll go into later the causes, but it's important to note that the situation is really, for the whole region, I think one can say, acute. The Middle East is really the most water scarce area in the world. It also has the largest food deficit, and it's the only region that's experiencing an increase in hunger and poverty. As of this year, 40% of the region's population is living in conditions of absolute scarcity, which means below 500 cubic meters of water per year per person. But these are just figures. So this is the interesting thing, that you have these international limits and these figures, but what does it look like? So on the one hand, you have Egypt. So this is a water scarce country. This is the Nile. And this is also where it's interesting to think about perceptions, because of course, when you have the Nile flowing in front of you, it's difficult to think that water is scarce. And so when you speak to people in Cairo, it's, you know, they say, well, look at the Nile. It's the mother Nile. It's there. How can you say this is scarcity? Yet Egypt is now really a water scarce country. It's also dealing with issues of pollution. It's dealing with political tensions with the upstream countries. So it is in a very bad situation, yet the Nile still flows. A different example is the Barada River in Syria, which is the main river that used to feed Damascus, which is the capital of Syria, as you all know. This used to flow from the anti-Lebanon mountains through a valley and then spread through the city. And it used to be for drinking water, but also for all the gardens around the city. This is what the Barada River looks like today, or not today, but in 2009 this was. So you see that here, that's the bank, and that's actually not the river, that's just rainwater flowing through. So the Barada River has drowned out. Obviously much smaller than the Nile, I'm not trying to... but this is in a country that's known to be comparatively water rich in the region, and yet a fruit grower in the Barada Valley had to abandon his orchard because there was no water anymore. So what are the causes? Of course, there are many, and I don't think I'll be able to name you all of them, but I will focus on three, which I think are important and which also are interconnected. The first is the huge population growth in the region over the last 60 years. I'm getting ahead of myself, sorry. I have a slide just... this is just again to repeat that the issue that this has always been a very water scarce region, and that there was historically, I think, a strong... there was a way of maintaining the ecological balance, because there was also a way of living with this scarcity. So on the one hand, there was great technological innovation and very clever ways of dealing with the scarce water, of collecting it, of conserving it and using it. And many of these techniques some of them are still in use, but they have been superseded by, obviously, modern technology. The region has few large rivers. As you probably know, there is the Nile, there is the Tigris and Euphrates, there is the Jordan, which is always named as one of the big rivers, but it's actually a very small river. And apart from that, there aren't really many large surface water resources. There are large groundwater reserves here, and there are groundwater reserves up here, and in Saudi Arabia as well, very large ones, but they are also being depleted very rapidly. So this ecological balance that was historically maintained has been disrupted over the last 60 years. And so one of the reasons for this disruption is the massive population growth, which has made, obviously, the amount of water that is available per person smaller, which is logical. So this has also, so not only was there massive population growth, but also shifts in population. So population groups moving across the region, the establishment of nation states, and then the rise of technology, which, well, there are many, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself again. This is again to show you the more visual impact of population growth. So this is Damascus in 1900. 143,000 inhabitants. You can see very well here the gardens that surrounded the city, which were very famous throughout the region. And this is Damascus in 2010, which was at the time city. This is so Greater Damascus was a city of more than 6 million inhabitants. That's including the suburbs. And as you can see, the gardens have largely been covered by concrete, and there's not much left. And so if you think back to the slide of the Barada River, which was a big river, but not such a big river, obviously that's not a river that can feed 6 million people and gardens. So this is why Damascus is now a water-scarce city. And before the war, there was actually no real awareness of this. So you lived in that city and you didn't really feel like we're living in a water-scarce city, and people didn't experience it that way. And that's, again, an effect of technology where as long as you have water coming from the tap, you don't really think, well, where is it coming from? Should I save water? There was just a kind of business as usual, whereas obviously the situation, the Barada River had dried out. The rivers that went through the city were just garbage dumps, but no one really seemed to think or make connections about that. So this advent of technology, so obviously this had many multiple effects. I think there's effects on different levels. So you have obviously the harnessing of large quantities of water, the dams and the barrages that were able to be built. This is known in the water world as the hydraulic mission. So the idea of building large structures, containing the water, and there's a big, so I think more on a level of perceptions or on a level of ideologies. There's also an idea that technology can control nature and that we don't anymore need to think about that we live in a water-scarce region. I don't think this is at all unique to the Middle East. I think we can look to the United States and see similar effects from just the belief in, as long as you build a large dam, the solution will be, there won't be any question of scarcity anymore. I think Israel currently is also dealing with this in the sense that Israel is very ahead in the region in many aspects of technological innovation in water, and yet now they are still facing a multi-year drought, and they're even then reaching the limits of their technological innovation. So obviously you had these mega projects like the Aswan Dam. At the same time, motor pumps, much smaller technology, but gave this incredible potential to just start drilling and pumping up water, which has had a huge impact on water reserves throughout the region. I think, you can say across the region, there has been a huge overuse of groundwater. Groundwater is an interesting thing because it's invisible. And so it's very difficult to know where is it exactly, how much of it is there, what are the reserves, how long is it going to last. And for governments who maybe don't have that much knowledge of this groundwater, it's encouraging to say just drill, irrigate, grow more crops and not worry too much about the consequences. And we are seeing the consequences now. So as a direct result of the population growth, the technological advances, there was also the need to expand irrigated agriculture to increase food security. And that's again also linked to the ongoing instability of the region, the conflicts. At the same time, the mode of agriculture in the Middle East is still has not been innovated, I can say, and I don't have exact figures in my mind, but the more than I would say at least 70% is still irrigated in traditional ways, as you can see here, which is flood irrigation, which is a very wasteful way of irrigating, and so there is. On average, still today, 85% of water in the Middle East is used in agriculture. And a lot of this water is wasted and also used to irrigate crops that aren't necessarily economically viable. And so there is there's a huge issue to be addressed there in the sense of agricultural reform, which then again remains very difficult because it's very difficult to change these very long traditions of how agriculture is done, and also it's very difficult because farmers traditionally also have a lot of power in the region and land is very important. So this is I think these are the three really major causes. I would summarize that. So these are kind of these are the roots in the sense. So these causes that I named, I think the first is uncontrolled population growth, as I said. The way the technology was developed, the way agriculture was developed, I think are summarized in the next 4 points, in where there is just a huge ambition, a huge overconfidence in what technology can bring, in that there was a limitless amount of water, in that there was no end to the growth that was possible. At the same time, a lot of short-sightedness. So over the 18 years that I've worked on water, I mean, when I started, it was a water crisis, but people were saying, well, maybe in the future we'll need to do something. And, you were standing in front of an empty dam reservoir and they were kind of like, well, it will be okay. And so this lack of sense of urgency still exists today in ways that I find completely incomprehensible. But that is a huge problem. And another thing which I think I'll come back on later as well is a kind of thinking in categories or in boxes, and so water is not considered part of. Water is fundamental. You cannot have agriculture, you cannot have a city, you cannot have life without water, and yet it's very much seen as separate from many other aspects of life in a country or of politics. It's seen as separate, whereas it should actually be much more integrated in all considerations of policy making, and even of also regional water management, which is still very weak because everyone is still trying to get their own water supply and not grant any to their neighbors, etc., etc. And that's not going to work in the long term for the future. Just on the last point, undervaluing. So that's one thing that is changing slowly, but still important, is that water is extremely underpriced throughout the region. So countries are now introducing, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states have just introduced a block system for domestic water, but this happened beginning of this year. And so before that it was virtually for free, which means that I think it's Gulf state, is it? No, I think it's US, Canada, the Gulf, Saudi are the largest domestic water users, and that's on a level of like 400 liters per day per person water use, which is huge. Okay, to move on now. So the impact of this long-term mismanagement. The impacts are multiple. They're on a level of environmental level, on a human level, on a political level. Again, I can't be exhaustive, but I'll name a few. So, first of all, on a level of just landscapes, which has become one of my interests in just seeing how landscapes have changed. So this is the Jordan River, the mighty Jordan River, which is something I can also talk about for a very long. Very interesting how it's a holy river, and so the perceptions of it as being mighty are very persistent, whereas this is the Jordan River. That's Israel, and that's Jordan. And that's sewage, and this is where people go and baptize, because it's holy water. So that was 2013. So similarly, groundwater. As I already mentioned, huge problems of depletion of groundwater. This is the Ras Al Ain spring. It's on the Syrian-Turkish border. It used to be one of the largest karst springs in the world, and it's dried out. And the reason it's dried out is that on the Turkish side of the border, they've drilled 2,000 wells and they're growing cotton. And on the Syrian side of the border, they've drilled 4,000 wells and they're growing cotton and lots of other things. I don't know if they now are still, but this was in 2009. Irrigated wheat as well. So this is, I think this is a tragedy. I think this is terrible. And I think it's also this is non-renewable water. So that's it. And this is how you see landscapes disappear. This whole spring system is actually a huge groundwater system in this border zone, and linked to that is a river called the Khabur River, which has also almost disappeared. The wildlife there has disappeared. These steppe lands have just become desert. So this obviously has huge impacts, not only on the environment, but also on the people living in that area. The dwindling of water resources and the growing scarcity is also, of course, leading to tensions between countries in the region, because everyone is vying for the same supply. I'm sure you've all heard about the upstream-downstream disputes. So the Jordan River is one of the very highly contested rivers, even though it's a very small one. The Tigris-Euphrates system, this is the Euphrates on the Syrian border, is also very much contested, and there is, for none of these rivers, and groundwater is not even, I'm not even discussing shared groundwater because that's even more complicated. There are no international agreements on any of these rivers that are valid and that are being respected. There are, between some of the countries, there are bilateral agreements, but there's no river that all the riparians have an agreement, and there are no, so the example of, for example, what we have, the Mekong in Asia or the Senegal, this kind of setup does not exist in the Middle East yet. Let's say it, hopefully. Together with dwindling quantity, we also have decrease in quality, unfortunately. So the little water that's left is often highly polluted. There is a movement towards more water treatment. The conflicts that have started since 2011 have also stopped that again, because in many countries there were really concerted efforts to start building the treatment plants and to stop release of wastewater straight into the environment. But obviously many of these projects have never been completed and are stalled. The result is that you have untreated sewage, but also industrial waste, medical waste that are just flowing freely into the environment. A large problem is salinity. On the Tigris-Euphrates, this is very much a problem as you go further downstream. The salinity levels rise to such a rate that you actually cannot use the water anymore at all. And I see that I've written equipment here twice, but sorry about that. So there's very weak monitoring of the water quality. Partly, currently because some of these areas are not even accessible to monitor the water quality, but also because the equipment is often lacking or is not up to standard and you don't get reliable data. The lack of data is another big problem in the region, because it's difficult to make policy when you don't have data to know what the water resources are. Then another problem is desertification, which is due to resource mismanagement. Not only the overuse of water, but the overuse of rangelands. So this is a really interesting slide, which I love to talk about because it's in eastern Syria near Palmyra. They opened in the 2000s a nature reserve, and the problem. So the Syrian steppe, which is vast and huge, used to be managed by nomads under the Badia system. So this was that. Nomadic tribes would there was this system of the Hima where tribes would go through an area, and if they had grazed this area, then that area would be left alone, and tribes would go somewhere else to graze their flocks. Now, in the 1950s and 60s, actually, the Assad regime decided to. They wanted, basically, the tribes were always very difficult to control, and so the idea was we're going to settle the tribes. The Badia is no longer theirs, and we are going to make the Badia free for all. Everyone can go there, anyone can graze anything. Number of flocks of sheep and goats and camels increased absolutely massively, and so basically the Badia has died. And the interesting thing here is this is a fence, this is the nature reserve. Here there was no grazing, and this is grazing. So this is an Italian ecologist who lived in Palmyra for 10 years and worked to set up this nature reserve. And he always loved showing this, and I now also love showing it, because the argument of the Syrian government was that everything was climate change. And this is a very good proof that if you let nature recover, it can recover, but it needs to be the pressure on the natural resources has become such that their irreversible damage is being done. So from the environmental impacts, you get the human impacts, which is that obviously as water supplies dwindle, rural populations can no longer sustain their livelihoods. So this means that people either abandon their land or, well, they're in any case abandoning agriculture. Many then leave to the city. Others start developing other businesses in these areas. In terms of food security, this obviously means that, again, more needs to be imported. But there is no... this is... I think you can say that this is across the region a big problem, and I think that there's a big problem of governance and of enforcing law, because there are laws about water use, there are laws about how to run agriculture, but they are just simply not implemented. And the problem is that even, especially with groundwater, it's very difficult to monitor groundwater extraction. It's difficult for governments to keep a grip on who is digging wells where and how much are they extracting from them. And this is, I mean, the consequence is that you get then depletion of the groundwater resources. So this is another consequence, is that the environmental degradation, once people can no longer stay on their land and sustain their livelihood in the areas where they live, they migrate. They migrate to cities, and this has been, of course, going on for decades. In the case of Syria, there was a very big drought, which you may have heard of in the late 2000s. And during this drought, whole families migrated from the northeast to other parts of the country. Some of them went to cities, but many of them also went into these kind of informal tent camps that just sprung up, which were illegal, where they had no electricity, they had no water, and these people lived there and then were working on other people's lands to earn a living. Obviously, there's also here a link then with conflict, which is complex, and I think I'm not going to say too much about right now, but I hope that we can discuss afterwards. I think the current conflict in Syria, I'm not going to go too much into it. Definitely what is the case is that the refugee crisis that has resulted from the conflict in Syria, which has driven people from their home within Syria and made people internally displaced, but also driven people into Lebanon, Turkey and Jordan. This has also put huge pressure on resources in host communities. So I'm sure you are all familiar with the situation in Jordan, which is an extremely water-scarce country and which are now hosting a large population of Syrians in the desert in an area that basically only has groundwater, and the groundwater is being depleted, the groundwater is being polluted because there aren't any proper wastewater treatment systems. So this is another problem. Okay, I'm coming to the end. I just want to make two more points about perceptions. So in all of this, you have how do people perceive, this is what started me on water 18 years ago. How do people perceive water in a culture where it's scarce? I'm from Holland, we have too much. How is it? That was my initial question when I set off. And when I first went on my first trip through the Middle East, I was surprised because I thought actually everyone thinks about it like us. They don't really think about it and they waste it like we do. And so then I also became more and more startled with the unbelievable lack of awareness and how can people not see how bad this situation is. Now, I think that this situation is changing. There is awareness growing. There is a sense of also that the threat of coming climate change will worsen the already bad situation. I still think governments are insufficiently prioritizing water. I think water should be much more central to everything, really. But then I'm like advocating my own. For me, water is so fundamental that it should be much more central to all policy making. It should be more integrated into all aspects, really, of policy making. I'm going to go quickly through some of the reasons that I've identified over the years for this lack of awareness. So I divided this into two sections. In the first is before 2011, where I think this is and this hasn't changed, the first point, which is that regional instability and the lack of security, economic insecurity, has always meant that water was just not a priority. I've interviewed ministers and water policy makers who just said, well, you know, it's easy for you to say you live in a country where things work. We're first going to build our dam and then we'll think about the environment. So it's there's an idea that water is, you know, if you're in the middle of conflict, you cannot think about sustainable water policy. At the same time, another very important point is the lack of public concern even about water, I think, is very much linked to the very centralized systems in many of these countries, and also the very centralized water management system. So it almost encourages a sense of, well, it's not my problem, it's the government's problem, I'm just going to use water. Then there is the undervaluing, which I already mentioned, which has to do with the pricing and also with an idea that water should be a right rather than being a gift, which it was traditionally in the religions of the region. I'll skip the water as sensitive. It's too long to explain. I think I've mentioned Right, and so the scarcity, this is again a thing of perception, that as long as this water keeps coming out of a tap, or as long as you still see the Nile flowing by, you just don't think that scarcity really, it can't be that bad. If it's, if I can still see the water and if I can still have a shower, well, we'll see tomorrow what comes. And the other thing, which is an interesting thing, is that water scarcity is not precise. It's not a tsunami. It's not an earthquake. It's not a disaster. It's something that takes decades, and there's a little less water every day. So you can't pinpoint the moment when suddenly there was water scarcity, and so that's also a way in which it remains invisible. Okay, quickly. So now I feel like things are shifting. Things are darker as well, because the region is darker also. Yes, so the regional conflicts are, well, it's an obvious thing. In Iraq and Syria, you can't now go and think about how am I going to develop water policy, because people are just trying to survive. So it's difficult to even conceive of how are you going to manage water, because the countries have fallen apart. And yet it has to be done, because it will be fundamental to peace building and to rebuilding as well. I still feel that many governments in the region are not acknowledging the severity of the crisis, and I feel that there's a lot of shifting blame to neighboring countries, to climate change. There's no acknowledgement of, okay, the way we were doing this for the last 50 years is no longer sustainable. We cannot continue this way. We need to adopt a new, we need to take a new path and completely change how we do this. And then this last point is the thin line between, on the one hand, what I've seen very much over recent years is this almost sensationalizing of and these apocalyptic kind of predictions of, climate change, conflict, everything together, it's the end of the world. And this doesn't help, because the perception then among the general public in the region is just water is so depressing, I don't even want to think about it. And they have to think about it because it's the future. So, and on the other hand, you shouldn't downplay it, because it is a really important issue. So but that's a very tricky way. How do you balance that? That's it. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you have lots of questions, and I hope we can discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. That was great. That was really fascinating. And your throat must be dry.
Yes.
So take a moment to collect thoughts and offer you some
Thank you.
Water. How appropriate. And I see plenty of other people drinking their water, and how appropriate that is too. There's a roving mic for as we start with questions to you. And as you said, I'm sure there will be plenty of questions, and I'll toss in a couple of my own from time to time as well. But there's one here in the front row, and then after that there'll be one in the second row, and then one in the fourth row on the other side. So let's hear the first couple of questions.
Yeah.
And then
I'm going to write them
see
down
how
before I forget.
see how that goes. And could you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Ron Pavelis. I'm retired, and but I live here in Sweden. And what leaped out at me in your presentation was the issue of governance. And then in developing that thought, if there were good governance, it would have to be, it seemed to me, quite authoritarian in order to bring all these nation states together to collaborate. And I'm just wondering, is there any hope for good governance in this area from your perception?
And pass it behind you. Ashok.
Ashok Soyen, Uppsala University.
Oh, I'm honored.
Thank you. I think it was a very interesting lecture, and you brought the issues which you are really supposed to be brought in. The one thing which you didn't touch, or at least you wanted to probably to avoid is the transboundary aspects.
Yes.
The Euphrates Tigris, the Turkey and the GAP project, which is extremely critical for the water scarcity here down, and then Syria and Iraq do not have much say into that matter, and Iran is also another player. The Jordan, same thing. I mean, there is the issue of transboundary issues. How you like to see the transboundary water issue to be addressed in the region, which will able to address some aspects of the climate change related challenges?
And there was a third question here. Was yours about either governance or transboundary?
It's kind of linked.
Okay, go ahead and let's try and then see how you go with all three.
Okay. Lucia Ardovini from the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. I guess I have two questions, but they're sort of related to what the previous questions were about. So the first one is relating to transnational water, right? What's going to happen with the dam that is now being built on the Nile in Egypt? Because obviously that's going to cause water scarcity. Yeah, the Ethiopian one. And the second one is, I was wondering whether you could say a bit more about the link between the lack of water and conflict. Because especially in the Syrian case, there seemed to have been an agreement for a while that the drought was one of the drivers of the civil war, and now people are sort of like going against it. So I was just wondering what your position on that is.
Okay. Okay. So governance, any hope for good governance? Very difficult to be optimistic about that. I would hope so. I really would, but
Francesca, could I break the question down into two components?
Yes, please. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
One is the big question of good governance.
Yeah.
Democracy, accountability, transparency, inclusiveness, dignity, voice, etc. All of those issues. And another one is governance of water resources, part of which is a technical issue, and it's about competence and within organizations it is that tasks are given which are sensible, which fit a strategy, that the tasks are then carried out, that people are assessed, and those who are screwing up get tossed to one side and are given something else to do, and those who do their job well are rewarded, and water management progresses in an efficient way. And I think sometimes we talk about the two. I mean, both are governance, but one is governance of a country and one is governance of water resources. And there is obviously a relationship. I don't want to separate them completely. But do you think, I mean, you've looking back over, let's say, the pre-2011 period, does it seem to you as if in the countries that you're relatively familiar with, the record was uniformly bad?
Yes.
So there's a competence question as well as a broader democratic governance question. And that's why it's hard to find a starting point.
There's a problem with data. There's a problem with human capacity, so that the staff working there in all the, I mean, I would say in the ministries, right? So I'm talking about on a government level, are underqualified often. And I mean, I would say this is the case in Jordan, it was the case in Syria, in Iraq, Egypt. Oh my God. I think that is a problem, but that's not a problem that's unsurmountable. That the idea. I mean, I think there's also been a lot of effort to consolidate, to try to deal with these data gaps and this unreliable data, to improve data collection and data management, because that has obviously been a huge problem of not being able to monitor water resources, so not being able to really plan how to go forward. I think those things are not insurmountable, and certainly also the human capacity aspect. I mean, if there were better trained, I think it's also to do with, that's then, you see this then again branches out to education systems in those countries, people being trained on issue in ways that are not appropriate anymore to the workplace that they're going to go into. So that then there's like a mismatch. If you graduate from a university, you don't necessarily have the skills to then be able to work with the modern technology that's maybe coming in. But all these things are not insurmountable. That's just a question of adapting and fitting better the needs to. And then in terms of governance in general, it's. I think if there were a concerted effort, if there was an acknowledgement in the region that to cooperate, this sounds really cliche, but it's just a fact that if you cooperate over water, you get a lot further than if everyone's just sitting in a room saying, no, it's Iraq's fault, no, it's Jordan's fault, no, it's Syria's fault. That doesn't get anyone anywhere. And by acknowledging that there just have been wrong, that the approach that was taken in the 20th century is now antiquated, we don't even have to say wrong, that it just does not fit the current environmental situation, political situation, that there needs to be a new approach. If there were the will, but there needs, it always comes back to the political will to actually really stand behind that and then go forward, then I think, yes, there could be a future, but we'll see.
Transboundaries?
Yeah, transboundary. Well, this kind of it's related, right? It also has to do with governance, and it has to do with political will and with trust. There are all these cliche words I'm saying. I'm sorry, but it's there is a huge lack of. I mean, if you look at Jordan, Syria, I mean, there's just no trust at all, and there's no sense of having a partner to work with. I think between Turkey, Syria and Iraq it's the same. I think Turkey, it's the classic upstream, downstream. Turkey just maintains that it's doing everything right, and Syria and Iraq are downstream. They're suffering the consequences. Iraq is definitely suffering the consequences and does not have much leverage or power to influence the upstream partner. I don't know, but I'd be interesting to hear what you think as well. I think with climate change, obviously things are going to get worse and more, and I think there will be an acceleration as well, because things are going to get worse more quickly, and there's going to be a need, and maybe who knows, it will actually bring people together in a sense of like, now we don't have a choice, we have to now cooperate and actually come to equitable division of water and sharing of water. I think one of the big problems in the Euphrates-Tigris basin is also the pollution, because what Iran is releasing into the tributaries is also not really correct. I mean, Iraq is really turning into a sewage pipe of the region. So yeah, on the transboundary, the dam in Ethiopia, I have to admit, I mean, I read about it. I follow it, but I don't really know. I don't really know enough. I see that there's a lot of. There are, on the one hand, efforts to cooperate and to diffuse maybe some of the more incendiary language that was used at the beginning, but then every so often there's again some big statement that's very belligerent. I don't know enough. I don't know in terms of the effect that the dam will have on Egypt. I expect that it's just going to further regulate. I don't see the flow to Egypt will decrease, but will it? What the way the Egyptians paint it, in that they're going to not have any water or not, this is like, it's a mixed message. On the one hand, sometimes they say that, then they go to Ethiopia and they say everything will be okay. So I don't know, and I also don't know to what extent the full potential of the dam as it was announced and described is actually going to be completed, because it wouldn't be the first dam that is announced as being huge and generating I don't know how much electricity, and then it never happens. So it's, I think, remains to be seen. And the link between the lack of water and conflict. Yes, the drought. The drought. Well, I believe that the drought certainly played a role in, but it wasn't just the drought. It was years. It was years before the drought. The drought was the last drop. There was anger long before. I think the changing of the guard between the Assads, that's what really changed the agricultural situation in Syria. The subsidies were being built, broken down. The father Assad really was a countryman who was for the farmers, who really privileged the farmers incredibly. And Assad the younger was an urban president who didn't have this connection, and he was moving away from this huge reliance on agriculture. It was in name, it was still there, but it wasn't, and there was huge anger well before the drought. And the drought was not something that when I lived there, when you lived in Damascus, you didn't even really know there was a drought. It was just hot, but it wasn't really. And up in the northeast, there was drought, but people weren't complaining about the drought. They were complaining about subsidies that were being cut. And that was much more of because drought, it was a very severe drought, but at the same time, drought is a part of Syrian climate. So there wasn't that impression among farmers of this is the millennial drought that's really killing us. They were talking about the subsidies and just the whole fact that the government, that everything was so corrupt, and that was the anger.
There have been figures put forward about numbers of people who were leaving the land.
Except that's all wrong.
Go on.
Yeah, because that's that 1.5 million figure that's being bandied around without any.
So is there a right figure, or you?
No, I don't think that. Someone went and stood there, like on the edge of Raqqa governorate, and went like 1, 2. No, there is no precise. The figure that came out from the UN during the drought, there were these drought assessment, and it was actually those drought assessments were being made to request money from the donor community for the drought, and during that period, I need to get my figures right. I think it was between 300 and 500,000 people. That was in 2008-9. The 1.5 million figure is something that's been brought into life by. So there was someone working at the State Planning Commission called Mohamed Alouche, and he was interviewed by IRIN, the UN. And he, I think, said, about 1.5 million. And then this got taken into an academic piece, and then it started living a life of its own. And now everyone says more than 1.5 million, and there's absolutely no basis for it.
So
and I'm not saying
large numbers, but well below.
Yes, I'm not saying,
million.
Obviously there was a huge exodus from the region. That the other thing that's important to say, though, is that I showed you the slide where there was environmental migration. That camp was Mazarib camp in the south of Syria. That camp existed 10 years before the drought. That environment, so the migration from the north to the south, seasonal migration or migration during a year that just wasn't so good, existed. The big difference was that now whole families were migrating. They were also not migrating with the idea this is where we're going to stay. They still had their house up in the north. They were just waiting for the drought to pass. So it wasn't this idea of like we're abandoning everything, we're leaving. Often, in many cases, the women stayed back. The men went to the south or to Lebanon. In Lebanon, I interviewed masses of workers who'd been there since the mid-1990s. From Idlib province, from Aleppo province. They were like, the water ran out, we left. Was not only the drought, didn't start with the drought as well.
Okay. Question back there. We'll take another 3. There's one here, 1, 2 rows in front, and then one at the back on that side.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Johan Shar. Going back to the transboundary issue, particularly between Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Turkey. I know, and maybe Ashok could comment on this. There's the recurrent event in Sweden, the Stockholm Water Week,
Yes.
organized by SIPRI,
Yes.
where there has always been, particularly before 2011, I think, a relatively informal exchange at the technical level between water managers or hydrologists from these countries. So there has been an ongoing kind of dialogue at that level. What has that resulted in? Where is it? Is there a potential for sort of resuming something if things stabilize politically? And also, could you comment on the regional government in Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, which is now very different from the case under the central government, a government with much more legitimacy and possibly the potential to address these kinds of issues. Do you have any comment on that?
Shall I wait for all the questions?
Which would you prefer to do?
I don't mind.
Then wait, and we'll take the next question.
I have to write it down.
Yeah, it's coming.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I was wondering, though, because I have heard you mention almost all the countries in the region with issues and reasons for the problems that is faced right now, that they all face. But you somehow did not mention Palestine, although this is the conflict. And it is also, we have a severe issue of water, and also a number of countries are trying to help, and there is a lot being done. So I would like to hear your take on this. Thank you.
And maybe after you've asked your question, now you could introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Hala Faris. I'm the ambassador of Palestine here in Sweden.
And then pass it to the back, Alexander.
Bakr Fattah, ambassador of Iraq. First, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. The first question is very naive. I'm asking for the standard need of the 1 person of the cubic meter in the air, the standard. And the second, from time to time we hear some news. It say that we didn't see such kind of drought from 100 years ago. What means? It means before 100, the humanity also suffered from such kind of the drought. The third, the good governance is very important, and the good policy. And I think that the international community, they are not very interesting with the problem of the water and scarcity of the water. That's very important. And sometimes the good governance is not just only for the policy, because sometimes it's deliberately some government for the problem of the crisis, political crisis and the internal crisis. They, as we see in 1980s in Iraq, the drying of very large amount of the land, of the marshland, yes, which is caused by the Iraqi government. And second, also drying of the springs in the Kurdistan of Iraq. We see, I saw this. This is a problem, is very important. And I am agree that when the one problem is very important, one factor for creating such kind of the civil war or the internal crisis, as we saw in Syria in 2010 and 2011, in Syria they are suffering from the very, very, severe drought in Syria. I think it's one factor. It's one drop, as you said, it's one factor very important that caused such kind of a civil war in Syria. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's it, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, trying to remember the beginning of your question. Iraq, I wrote down Iraq, Jordan, and Turkey. Yes, the monitoring and the. Well, yes. Hopefully, probably you know more about this, but hopefully it could be restored. I know that. Where was I? there are still efforts on a technical level, I think, but this is something that one always hears about water. That, I mean, on the Palestinian level, this is one thing that was always said, that during the conflict, on the technical level, cooperation continues. But then there's again the question, is that then fake cooperation or is it hegemony? Then you get into something else. But I think the in terms of monitoring along, for example, in the Tigris-Euphrates basin, partially, I think it did, especially on the Tigris, it did continue in areas that were accessible. I think I might be wrong now, but I have a feeling that the German BGR continued even during the because they had lots of things set up, and that they continued to the places where they were still able to access. And so certainly, I think usually with water and the technicians, I mean, they like to say that they are outside of the conflict, and they, you know, when they meet, they can talk and they can agree also on what would be the thing to do. It's just that politics gets in the way, and ultimately you need the politicians to stand behind the issue and actually really take it on and make it a priority. That's I think the problem. But the technical will, I think, or the will of just technicians or just the engineers working on the ground, I think is there because they're the ones who are working with this and seeing it worsen. For Iraqi Kurdistan, I'm afraid I can't really comment because I don't know enough about it. I'm going to pass because I'll probably say something that doesn't make sense. For Palestine, I did not talk about Palestine because I actually, the reason I didn't talk about Palestine is because I feel it's a different kind of scarcity, because it's a political scarcity. So that's why I left it out, because I think I could come here again tomorrow and then talk for half an hour about Palestine, because it's such a different, the circumstances are, the basic situation of that they are suffering from climate change, that they have the natural scarcity. There are governance problems as well within Palestine, within the PWA. There have been problems, but the major, obviously, problem is the occupation, and that's something that's we could spend a whole afternoon talking about. And I've worked a lot in Palestine. I've worked a lot also on Gaza. The situation there is unspeakable, and I don't know why it's not being. To be honest, with Gaza, I'm speechless. Every year a report comes out saying 98% of water in Gaza is not fit for human use. Nothing happens. Like, what? So this is something that that is a tragedy, and that I find there's no words to actually. It's a tragedy, and it's highly complex, just because it's enmeshed in such an incredibly complex conflict that has been going on for so long. And for Iraq, okay, so yes, first of all, the standard needs. So there is this is international standards. You have 1,700 cubic meters per person per year, but this is not the water that you drink, or this is the water that you need for everything. So to make your clothes, to produce your food, everything. So 1,700 is considered the acceptable level. Once you get down to 1,000, it's scarcity. I think it's called chronic. I should look this up. I'm feeling like it's water scarcity, and then 500, it becomes chronic scarcity. Right, that's it. Yeah. And then you have absolute scarcity as well, no? That's 200. Huh? Oh, because I thought there's also the level of 200 now, because some countries are so low that you have under 200. 100-year drought, yes. Well, I guess the reason that they say this is because 100 years ago that's until where the data goes. There's no data from longer than 100 years ago, so maybe that's why you hear like this is the the worst drought in 100 years, because before that time they didn't register the data. And it also looks good as a headline. It's like sensational, you know. I see. Actually, when I was in the east of Syria, very near the Iraqi border, there were a lot of. This was in 2009. They were talking about the dust storms that were killing their crops. There were hot storms that were coming from Iraq, so this is, I think, an area where there's a lot of shared environmental issues in the desertification and then the climate change, water scarcity. I think there are many similar features there.
Okay, we'll take another round of questions if there are. Or Ashok, did you have something to come back on the transboundary monitoring thoughts? You need to wait for the microphone.
I think there is still, when the conflict was going on, there has been an informal talk going on among the technical level. And I think that is always, if you look at all the river water conflicts, or the regional conflicts were going on, the technical level still keeps talking. And that helps because of their professional relationship, which has been established for a long time, and personal friendship. But there is a limit to it. And I think in the Euphrates-Tigris basin, there is a limit, has almost arrived. I mean, and there is a place where they cannot really go into. So I think that is somehow is a breaking point in a sense. But the question, I think I just want to mention one thing. Coming back to the Ethiopia issue, that one. Actually, there will be no water, less water available to Egypt. It's only the time of water availability,
right.
because it's a hydroelectric dam,
right.
or the Ethiopia hasn't really planned yet any kind of irrigation projects. Mm-hmm. So all these dams are hydropower dams, and that will only keep the control in the hand of Ethiopia, and that's why Egypt is worried.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so further questions from you all? Francesca, given the absence of questions there,
yes.
I wanted to ask one. We all sort of see things based on our starting point. So, in academic terms, what you declare to be the independent variable or the dependent variable, what is it that you're really focusing on? You've obviously been reading material about environmental change and political instability and conflict. Do you feel that there is a kind of an adequate range of evidence and theory and perhaps methodology? I mean, have we got the tools that we need to be proving or really clarifying what the links are between the different parts of this complex picture? I mean, I can understand how one could be studying water in the Middle East for a whole long time and really place very little emphasis on conflict issues. And I can also understand how one could be studying conflict issues in the Middle East and start thinking, as many people have said, that the next generation of conflicts is going to be all to do with water or its absence. And I just wonder, as we kind of head towards, around this issue and as we head towards the future, whether, you've been studying for a while now on this, have we got the evidence, the theories, the approaches that we need in order to be able to discuss these through clearly? Are we struggling to find the right language, the right conceptual vocabulary, or is it there and these are really kind of pretty straightforward issues to take on?
No, they're not straightforward, that's for sure. I don't know whether you wow, it's a super difficult question.
You can blame the audience because they weren't asking questions.
Well, there's a long bibliography of water, the water war. That's been a long discussion, and it's evolved, and I think it's appropriate to ask whether where that started, whether the arguments used in there are still appropriate to the type of conflicts we're seeing now, and to also the acceleration of different phenomena like the scarcity increasing, the climate change being unpredictable. I think there are a lot of variables that make it much more complex than perhaps it is now being. I find it very difficult to. I think it maybe also relates to what I was saying, this thin line between sensationalizing or downplaying, or there's also this tendency to oversimplify, because it is so complex, and water on its own is already very complex. Conflict is very complex, and when they come together, it's almost unentangleable. So you then, and that's not a word, but then I think that makes it incredibly challenging to work on and to explore, because there also, of course, as in any conflict and as in any water situation, it's very specific to the place. And so it's very difficult to generalize or to come with set rules or set ideas, because for every situation there are different conditions, surrounding conditions, causalities. So I would say it's a extremely challenging area to be working on.
We have trouble with complexity, and I think it's not just politicians and journalists with their headlines and so on who like simplicity. I think sometimes also that academics are just as bad, wanting to isolate one factor and study what its causal effect is, or to isolate one consequence and study how that came about. Because there are lots of different factors feeding in, they interact, but they don't produce just one consequence. They produce lots of effects coming out, and distinguishing which is the most important and so on. And I think it's that I'm actually writing at the moment, or trying to write together with a colleague who's sitting at the back here, trying to write a chapter on water and climate and political instability and insecurity in the Middle East. And we find ourselves struggling with exactly this.
Yeah.
And on a bad evening, it can turn into being a very indeterminate argument in which you just say it's just complicated. And I don't like that as an ending place.
Yeah.
So therefore I'm going to ask you a second question, which is, what are the one or two takeaways that people should have from listening to you and thinking about water? Now you've got to talk headlines. What's the couple of headline thoughts that people should be taking away from here?
The couple of headline thoughts.
You can have three if you like.
Three. Okay.
And there can be a semicolon in them.
Oh,
it's okay.
Goodness. I would say that the Middle East is facing a severe water crisis, or is this not a severe? That's obvious, but I think that's important, and that water needs to be prioritized in possibly any discussion on the Middle East. It should be more upfront in considering anything else happening in the Middle East.
All of these issues which we might think about: economic development, human rights, conflict.
Because it will come in there.
Yeah.
For example, sorry, I haven't said my third, but last week there was in the news this new city in Saudi Arabia, neon and beautiful images of hot houses, and wow, great. I was like, water? Well, so they're going to desalinate, or they're going to empty their groundwater, but still, like, I don't know how they're going to do that. And the third, that that to build a good governance and to build a sustainable way of managing water, peace is a prerequisite, because you cannot build a sustainable system in the unstable situations that exist today. It's very difficult to build. The water is a. There needs to be a longer view. There needs to be more, also longer view backward, to not just say, oh, it was the drought in Syria. It's going back 50 years, and going forward, there needs to be that thinking, and the policies that are built need to be built thinking way forward.
Right. Okay. So
that's it.
There is a Middle East water crisis,
yes,
of great severity. Water needs to be in the forefront of our thinking about the Middle East tout court.
Yeah.
Whatever it is that we're addressing. And there has to be peace in order to get long-term sustainable water policies.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
3 headlines. Thanks very much, everybody, and thank you to the online audience, and thank you, Francesca.
Thank you.